Welcome to the Picture This Photography podcast, where we talk about all things photography. And today, we're pleading, please end the megapixel war. We're going to be talking about when we like having a ton of megapixels, when it's not so practical, and what we could do instead of just constantly adding more and more megapixels to cameras. What could we do that would be better?
Yeah, I hope the manufacturers will listen to this because we deal with high megapixel cameras all the time, like 50 megapixel cameras, and then we stitch together big panoramas. It kind of sucks, right?
Yeah, so we're going to be going into all of that, and this podcast is made possible by Udemy. So thanks, Udemy, for making this happen.
Okay, we love megapixels, right?
Oh my gosh, I love them.
Our main cameras are a 45 megapixel D850, a 42 megapixel A7R III, and when we shoot with lower megapixel cameras, it's always a little disappointing.
Well, sometimes there are some things lacking that I would like. You know, there's some instances when it holds me back, like if I'm doing a street portraiture and somebody's not huge in the frame and I want to crop a little bit, and then it kind of loses that quality that I'm looking for.
And I know a lot of people argue, oh, I only make 8x10 prints, I only put stuff on Instagram, then you probably won't notice any difference. But we actually make big prints. Like I just made a 50-inch wide print. And even that with a 50 megapixel camera was cropped a little. It only ended up being like 120 dots per inch. So it could have been sharper. I could have used more megapixels for that big print. And so we do appreciate it when we can get it. But here are some of the reasons that it's impractical.
Yeah, it's not always for everyone. People have these huge cameras that they're speculating are going to come out, like 75 megapixel cameras, 100 megapixel cameras. Is that right for you? Is that really what you want? And these are the places where we think you're going to hit some limitations anyways. And one of them is weak lenses. You can't just put a crummy old lens on a great camera, folks.
No,
it's just
then
not going to look the way you want it to look.
Yeah, you get all the pain of dealing with 50 megapixels and none of the detail. It's a total waste of time. Here's an example, because I saw somebody shooting with this. They had the 50 megapixel Canon 5DSR, great camera.
Stellar.
And then they had the crappy Canon kit lens, the 24-105 f4. And DxOMark actually tests these things, and they determined that the amount of megapixels that you actually perceive in the final picture measures at about 14 megapixels. So a 50 megapixel camera producing 14 megapixel files. And that's been our experience too. We've tested these things, and when you compare it against an actual sharp lens, you see all this detail. But when you use kit lenses, lower end zoom lenses, you don't see it. You just don't get the detail. It is wasted. You are just getting blurry pixels. So why are you bothering with all the other downsides? So if you get one of these cameras, you also have to get really sharp lenses. Most of the time, not zoom lenses, but like expensive primes.
Or the takeaway might be you'd be better off with like a 24 megapixel camera and using that money to buy some nice glass instead.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Air. We love it. We hate it. It does present challenges, air, because there's atmosphere, and sometimes even if you have a ton of megapixels, you could be taking a landscape photo, and if there's a lot of distance between you and your subject, there's going to be atmosphere, there's going to be air, there's going to be humidity. You're losing the quality anyway. It's going to look exactly the same as a, let's say, 24 megapixel camera.
Yeah, we shot the 42 megapixel camera and a 24 megapixel camera side by side in the Grand Canyon, and I could not tell the difference with sharp glass.
And it's because the subject was so far away that there's just a ton of air.
Yeah, but that also kills you with wildlife, and we don't perceive this when we look at all the studio tests that all the camera reviewers, including us, do, because we do it at short range, where atmosphere isn't affecting anything. But then people get into the real world, and it's wasted because humidity and stuff.
Yeah, and it might not be wasted in the real world if you're taking, studio pictures or something like that. But this is an example of how those megapixels might not be working for you.
Let's take a minute and thank our sponsor, Udemy.
Udemy has over 24 million students with access to over 17 million minutes of video. They also have 35,000 instructors, over 80,000 courses, and are in 50 languages, which means, hey, any of you can learn because there's a teacher for everyone, there's a course for everyone, and it's going to be in a language that you understand. We recommend a sports and action photography course from Udemy.
Yeah, and I was really amazed by it. They had a professional sports photographer teaching sports, and he knew all the tips and tricks. It's not just about getting your shutter speed right, but he talked about being able to anticipate the moment, pointing your camera where the action was going to happen. He provides basically like a checklist of shots that you need, things that aren't obvious, like shots of the coaches, shots of the fans, shots of the players celebrating. And it was fantastic content from a real pro.
You can't go wrong because you're gonna learn something, and if you don't, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so try it. We think that you're gonna like it. Thank you, Udemy.
Check out the link in the description below. Focusing accuracy is another big problem.
Okay.
Because camera focusing is never perfect. Like people always think, oh, my camera hits focus 100% of the time. It doesn't, especially if you're using fast, sharp lenses and high megapixel cameras. You'll realize like we're lucky to get 50% on a lot of really shallow depth of field scenarios, even with top end cameras. And anything that's not perfectly in focus doesn't matter what the megapixels are, right?
Yeah,
Throw the whole thing out.
We don't necessarily have to just keep getting more and more megapixels. We could be working on focusing accuracy. I think that metric is more difficult to measure. You know, there's not just some number that tells people the focusing is great.
Yeah.
It's way easier to just slap a ton of megapixels on the box of a camera, on a box. Who looks at the box? You know, in your reviews, and people say it's a high megapixel camera, must be good. It's a lot more difficult to quickly convey the focus accuracy.
And it's another thing you don't see in the studio test because they'll get the focus right. But then if the camera misses it all the time in the real world, like it's not reflected. Depth of field is another problem. Like your megapixel count only matters on the focal plane. And depth of field doesn't really work the way you think it does. Like you can't plug it into a depth of field calculator that'll tell you everything from 3 feet to infinity is in focus. Because with these high megapixel cameras and sharp lenses, depth of field is like always razor thin. You will notice that stuff is slightly out of focus. So you can crank the f-stop up, right? And increase your depth of field. But then you get into diffraction.
Oh no.
Diffraction.
Oh no.
Light bending around the iris, the aperture.
Bending light?
Bending light, wrecking the sharpness. Shoot. And again, once you start to shut down, once you're outside of your lens's sweet spot, you might need that depth of field, but now your megapixel count doesn't matter at all because the diffraction is wrecking the sharpness of the picture. These are all things that just make megapixels not matter at all. High megapixel counts only matter in this like 1% of shots that typical people take.
1%. Where are you getting that number from?
I totally made that up.
You just made it up, didn't you? You just got called out. Camera shake is another problem with high megapixel cameras. When I moved to a higher megapixel camera, I just went out shooting street photography, and I was wondering why all of my pictures had some camera shake because I was trying to use the reciprocal rule. And I learned that you get far more camera shake when you're using a high megapixel camera. So you got to turn up that shutter speed, which means you're getting less light.
Yeah, exactly. It's more obvious, right? Same thing with tripod shake is a problem too. Like when we do our tests on high megapixel cameras, I can't shoot them on the first floor or the second floor of the house. Because even though nothing's happening, the house shakes a very little bit, something I never noticed until I started shooting very carefully with these high megapixel
Or if somebody
cameras.
walks by, which you might think, I'm not testing in my house, but if you've ever done night photography on a dock or an unstable surface, basically anything that's not concrete, the ground will move some.
Yeah, you can just be on dirt and the slightest amount of wind will wreck the sharpness on these cameras. Again, then all the megapixels that you're dealing with, the benefit of them are just gone. Like the same movement you'd see in a low megapixel camera, but you wouldn't have to deal with the massive files, right? Image noise is another problem. If you're shooting at the base ISO, you can see clear benefits from the higher megapixel cameras. But if you crank up that ISO, those benefits disappear.
They're gone.
Because high ISO doesn't capture a lot of detail on any camera. If you're shooting at ISO 3200, forget it. You might as well be shooting with an 8 megapixel camera.
You need light, and you need stability, and you need your subject to be close. Okay?
Buffering is also a huge problem. You got these huge files, the camera has to capture them and then move them to the memory card, and all these big megapixel cameras are slow too. You can be shooting landscapes, but maybe bracketing landscapes and shooting raw.
Sure.
And you'll fill up that buffer, and then suddenly you can't take pictures anymore.
And what do you do with your time then?
And if you're trying to shoot sports or something, like, forget it. It's too much
You
trouble.
fill up your buffer and then something amazing happens and you wonder, why did I do that?
You double the number of megapixels you have, you'd also double all your storage costs.
Yeah, so storage costs, something to take into consideration if you want a high megapixel camera.
You have to buy bigger SD cards.
Shoot.
Your computer disk drives need to be bigger. And your
Dang.
cloud backups, you're instantly doubling all your storage costs because you got to offload those somewhere, right? So you have 3 levels of storage that everybody needs to have, and they're all going to double. And once you get them into Lightroom, what happens?
Slow.
Painfully slow.
Sad. Frustration. Angry. These are all the feelings I've had.
I know. You get back, you're excited to look at your pictures, and Lightroom takes hours to process.
So that's something to consider, you know. Are you shooting professionally? Is the extra cost of storage and the frustration of processing these large files worth it to you? I don't know. I don't know you personally, but putting some points out there.
It's not worth it to most people. Most people aren't making any prints nowadays. And if they do, I always hear people talking about like tiny little 8x10 prints where it's not really going to matter very
Yeah,
much.
so talking about prints, are you actually going to print the photos large, which is one of the reasons you would want a high megapixel camera? Many people aren't.
Or maybe just cropping deeply. But I think what manufacturers should be working on instead is computational photography.
Yeah, so instead of just putting out these high megapixel cameras, we could be making cameras more interesting with the computational stuff.
I have the Google Pixel 3 here, and you have the iPhone, whatever the latest one is. And they keep making these big improvements with the cameras, but it's not because this is getting bigger or they're adding more megapixels. They're both low megapixel cameras. But they keep using computational photography. They use all the smarts built in here to make the pictures better. And it's really working. It's making a difference.
Excuse me. So what do you propose? What is one smart thing they can do instead of just crazy megapixels?
Camera manufacturers are mostly on this now, but they need to be building in sensor stabilization.
I love that. I love a camera with a stabilized sensor, and then you put some stabilized glass on there, and then you're hooked up. You could be as shaky as me and still get a nice shot.
I actually prefer unstabilized lenses for the most part. If a manufacturer stabilizes a lens, they have to make optical sacrifices. They have to put extra moving elements in there. And that's why stabilized lenses are almost always less sharp than their counterparts.
Did we just have a fight? Dang, are we just married still?
I like stabilized lenses too for some things, especially with telephoto lenses, but with the wide angle stuff, it's definitely better to have it only on the sensor. Panoramas are a fantastic way to increase the megapixel count because panoramas don't just have more pixels in a small space, but they effectively make both your sensor and your lens bigger. They just take lots of pictures and stitch them all together. This is built into all modern smartphones, but no modern cameras do this. Like, why can't you just pick up your Sony and just move it around and capture a big panorama? They actually used to have that feature and they took it out. That's a fantastic way to make huge high megapixel cameras. Another thing that smartphones are doing that I want to see in these cameras instead of high megapixels is to have them automatically overshoot and then automatically discard all the extra pictures. That can completely eliminate camera shake and tripod shake. Like when I push the shutter, don't take one picture, but take 10 and monitor the amount of movement that the camera is experiencing during each of those shots, pick the sharpest one and give that one to me. Because right now I have to do that manually. I have to be taking like 10 pictures and then I'll import them all into Lightroom and then go through them and be like, okay, there was some shake here, there was not shake there. But our smartphones can do that automatically. Why don't our cameras?
I just hear the commenters in my head being like, you're not a real photographer, shoot with film on a shaky bridge.
Ansel Adams didn't.
I've been doing photography for 130 years. You're an idiot.
I also want to see image stacking built into cameras because that's what these smartphones are doing. I can use the night sight in the Google Pixel is amazing.
It's an incredible feature.
I took a picture of Orion on my smartphone the other day, like the star constellation, and it looked really good. And it was handheld. It will just take a bunch of pictures over a second, and all of those that are sharp, it will stack them together. And it basically gives you the effect of having like ISO 5 or a much bigger sensor. It's amazing.
It's amazing.
These are things I wish camera manufacturers would do instead of giving us more megapixels.
I agree with you. I just am so pleased with how psyched you are right now. And I want this stuff to happen too.
Another thing I love is what we call like IBIS, where the sensor moves around and it will take multiple pictures and stack them, because this actually improves images way more than adding more megapixel does. It eliminates moire, like the weird fringing that you get in images, and just gets more out of your existing lens. Right now, you have to use it on a tripod, and that's kind of a pain. I wish they would develop some like proper handheld versions of this. Not exactly what we've seen from Pentax, which doesn't work well. And they always have the weakness where anything moving in the image gets all messed up. Which makes
like leaves blowing.
Yeah, it makes it unusable almost every time. But with some better artificial intelligence, they could fix that.
We need it. So how are we going to do this? We're talking about our dreams. We're talking about what we would want instead of more megapixels. But is it possible? Can technology keep up, Tony?
One way to do it would just be to pack a whole bunch of computational power into our cameras. And I consider that brute force, right? Because that would make every single one of our cameras more expensive, and that would make them less attainable, and that means not as many people will buy them, and that basically eliminates the possibility that it's ever going to happen. But there are ways to do this where we can use kind of thin client methods. We can use cameras that are less intelligent and don't require all the processing. Yeah, instead of producing like 100 megapixel stacked image that the camera then has to process in real time, you can use proxies. You can just save all the raw data and process it at a quarter the size. We do this in video all the time, where you'll edit with a 720p file and then you render a 4K file, and it makes things easier. Let me work in the camera or on my computer with a 5 megapixel file, and then when I'm ready to print, bring in the full megapixel file. That makes everything work faster, so you're not waiting on the processing all the time.
That is so smart. When we talked about this and we were kind of troubleshooting how we could deal with processing these huge files, I was blown away by that idea, Tony. I think you should do this professionally.
Another idea is cloud computing, something that smartphones are starting to use. They'll send the pictures off into the cloud, and then big monster supercomputers are processing the whole world's images. That way we're sharing this massive supercomputer instead of having to put all the computing power in each one of our cameras. That's why on your iPhone or your Google phone, you can search for cat and it will show you all your cat pictures. But that's not something our cameras can do, but our phones can do it, despite the fact that our cameras are much more expensive. So let's get our cameras connected to the cloud so they can start taking advantage of proper cloud computing technologies. Put some SIM cards in our cameras already.
Yeah.
Or they have Wi-Fi connections, they just don't do anything with it. They only connect your phone. How dumb is that? Like, connect to the internet. Okay, so I think I know how this is actually going to unfold.
You do?
Yeah, manufacturers are going to watch this podcast, and they're going to stop everything they're doing.
They're going to write a comment about your hair, probably, and then about how they don't like when I talk, and then what?
What I actually think will happen is we'll continue to see innovation in smartphones, specifically from Google and Apple.
Yeah, that makes sense, because they're doing all of these innovations on smartphones.
And they're tech companies, right? They're not companies that were founded 100 years ago. They're tech companies that are built agile and software-centric, which allows for just more agility. And then I think small manufacturers are going to see what's happening on the smartphones and realize they can actually adopt some of this technology. So they'll move it over into the cameras. And when I say small manufacturers, I mean not Canon, Nikon. I mean like Fuji, Pentax, Olympus, Panasonic, right? Because you always are working harder when you're in second place, or even more so when you're in like 10th place.
Yeah, and I also think that if you aren't Canon or Nikon, you feel like you have to maybe take a bigger risk to make yourself relevant.
Yeah.
You know, they don't want to take a big risk and then bruise their reputation.
Yeah, people buy Canon and Nikon just by default. So the small manufacturers will copy the tech from the smartphones, and then finally, after years of them losing business, the big manufacturers will finally copy the tech from the smaller manufacturers.
Remember mirrorless, how much they ragged on Sony's mirrorless cameras when they first came out? Mm-hmm. They just said they were going to go away. They were stupid. They were toys. That'll probably happen again.
That's exactly how it unfolded for them, right? Sony was the smallest manufacturer, so they jumped on the mirrorless tech, and Canon and Nikon did nothing until they saw Sony actually stealing their business, and then like, oh, maybe there's something to this mirrorless tech.
I'm scared.
People want this? Here's an example of how this happened in the past. I studied sensor stabilization and marked down when each manufacturer introduced it. The first incidence of sensor stabilization was in 2003 from Minolta.
That shocks me.
Yeah, we studied the history of Minolta. If you want to circle back and watch it, listen to another podcast, it's a pretty fascinating tech.
Yeah.
They were a very small kind of niche manufacturer, and they came up with what is one of the most important photography technologies in the last 30 years. 2006, Pentax picks it up. Again, a very small manufacturer. 2009, Olympus, small. 2014, Sony picked it up. Sony actually bought Minolta, but this is the first Sony camera that they released. And they were a very small manufacturer at the time. Now we see the bigger manufacturers doing it. Panasonic in 2016, Fuji finally in 2018. Nikon, who was the second biggest manufacturer, finally picks up on it in 2018 last year with the Z6 and Z7. And Canon, they still haven't done it. The number one manufacturer still hasn't picked up this incredibly useful 2003 technology. And that's what we will see with all these computational technologies. Canon will probably continue doing things the old way, just throwing more megapixels at it, bigger stats, instead of doing it the smart way.
Ooh.
That's just my prediction, based on having studied the history of so many of these different camera companies and how they adopt technology.
I think Canon's actually in a position where they have to start taking risks again.
Yeah, they're not going to be number one for long if they keep at it. That's it. I want to hear what people think about megapixels in the comments down below. What has been your experience? Do you want cameras that are 100 megapixels, 200 megapixels, or is it all just a waste? What do you think camera manufacturers should be working on instead? And what would you like to see in future cameras?
Yeah, and I was kind of curious, what do you think is the ideal number of megapixels? Do you think we should just max it out at 75, go a little bit more, and then work on other stuff? Or do you think we should just keep going and then fix the problems that you have with those high megapixel cameras? Like maybe we end up wanting a 100 megapixel camera and all the problems we listed will be solved somehow. No more air. I worry about that one.
And a thank you to our sponsor, Udemy. If you want to keep learning online, there's no better place to go than Udemy. Check out the link in the description, and you can sign up for a free trial and even watch that sports photography training class that I was talking about. Thank you so much.
They also have a cool app, so you can learn anytime, anywhere, on your train commute, whatever you want. Check it out. And see you next week. We do a new podcast every Wednesday. So we'll see you then. Thanks.